There's a classic song that goes like this. Bye bye, Miss American Pie. I know, I look like an Adonis and I sing like an angel. Now a line from that song talks about the day the music died. Well, 2023 could well go down in history as the year the Australian dream of owning your own home officially died. I'm Biko Konstantinos and that's what we're going to talk about today. Did you hear about the two blokes who dipped their balls in glitter for New Year's Eve? Pretty nuts. And you'd be pretty nuts, I reckon, if you didn't subscribe to my channel. So go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't, because I'm here to give you independent analysis and commentary. The basis of today's video is from this BBC article titled "The Year the Australian Dream Died." And if you've been watching my videos recently, you'd know that there's been increased global attention for the Australian housing crisis. And here's yet another example of an overseas media company writing about Australian housing. This just highlights to me that Australia has a massive problem. At the age of 31, Justin Dowes will never imagine he'd be living in a shared room in his childhood home. Here's a person who had a full-time, well-paying job in Sydney, was renting, but the current Australian housing crisis forced him to upend his life and move back in with his parents who live 2 hours away. Justin says it's humbling, but because the alternative is homelessness, feels extremely lucky that he has the backup of being able to return to his parents. This is a far cry from the promise of the great Australian dream. But it's even worse than having millions of Australians not being able to realise home ownership for themselves. With the rental vacancy levels being so ridiculously low in Australia, many Australians have been made homeless and many more are at risk of becoming homeless. All the stats are pointing to a sharp increase in homelessness across the entire country, and you just have to look at the sharp increasing number of tent communities to understand that the great Australian dream has now turned into an absolute nightmare. Now, the American dream was more like anyone can achieve success if they work hard enough. But the Australian dream seems to be more property focused. For generations, owning a house on a modest block of land was idealized as both the ultimate marker of success and a gateway to a better life. And property ownership really has become part of Australia's identity. Because if you own property, you can be classed as the haves, and if you don't own property, you could be classed as the have-nots. And the haves in Australia seem to benefit the most from government housing policies and central bank policies, while the have-nots seem to get screwed over at every turn. Now, the dream of home ownership was a real reality for anyone living in Australia prior to the year 2000. You see, back then, houses were extremely cheap compared to the average income, and a single person earning a below average wage could easily have afforded to buy their own home and pay off the entire house relatively quickly. But after 2000, things have slowly gotten worse and worse, and fast forward to current generations, the dream that was available to parents and grandparents is now basically out of reach for millions of people. After decades of government policies that treat housing as an investment, not as a right, many say that they will be lucky to even find stable, affordable places to rent. So we've gone from being able to easily afford a home and have a secure place of your own to now not even being able to find affordable rentals. So cheap, safe and secure to now expensive, can't find a rental, at risk of homelessness. And why? Decades of government policies that treat housing primarily as an investment or a way to generate wealth, so allowing greed to run rampant in the never satisfied search for more and more capital gains, while Australians who don't happen to own their own property are being pushed further and further towards poverty. The Australian dream is a big fat lie, Mr. Dowswell said. Well, I added in the fat. Almost everything that could go wrong with housing in Australia has gone wrong, says Michael Fotheringham, head of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. The only thing that could make it worse is if banks started collapsing, he said. Now, to me, this sort of statement makes it feel like the Australian housing market was just at the mercy of all these external factors. But in my opinion, opinion, it's been decades of policies that encourage speculative investment into property that has destroyed the housing market and turned it into a speculative play toy primarily for the rich. And it's so bad because housing is just so expensive now. The average property now costs around 9 times an ordinary household's income, which is triple what it was just 25 years ago. So that means it's now harder for a double income couple both working full time than it was just 25 years ago for a couple with only one wage earner. How about that for a kick in the nutsack? You've got the stress of both people in the couple having to work, and it's still bloody harder just because they were born more recently. That's what happens when you don't give a rat's ass about future generations. It's particularly dire in Australia's capital cities because they're so bloody expensive. Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Adelaide are classed as some of the least affordable cities in the entire world. And people might say buy regional because it's a lot cheaper, but for most people trying to work full time, that's not an option because you have to work in the office a number of days per week. Australia has made home ownership virtually unattainable for anyone without family wealth. And the boss of ANZ said that home loans had become the preserve of the rich. So as property has become more and more expensive, it's greatly affecting wealth opportunities for future generations. So if your parents own property, you're probably going to be okay. But if they don't own property, or if it's worth very little, then you're going to be starting from a massive disadvantage. So Australia's fast becoming a two-tiered class system, where you have the property haves who are surging ahead financially because their million-dollar property portfolios keep rising and rising. And then you have the property have-nots who are falling further and further behind due to being taxed to the hilt and receiving very little tax concessions, facing a cost of living and rental crisis. And then when they try and buy their own property, have to compete with massively cashed up property owners who are always able to outbid them. Chelsea Hickman is a 28-year-old fashion designer that has been working full-time for almost a decade and still can't even afford to rent an apartment by herself. You do everything you're told to do by going to uni, working full time, but if you're not fortunate enough to be born into family wealth, getting into the Australian housing market can feel like rolling a boulder up a giant hill. And even Tarek Bagansky, who personally says he's got it pretty good, laughs if he's asked if he'll ever own his own property. So this is the real big issue with Australia. You do what you're told, you study, you work full time, you try and save up a deposit, but it's so difficult trying to save from after-tax dollars, especially when we're in a cost of living and rental crisis, that it can seem almost impossible, especially with house prices rising massively year after year, so your deposit has to keep getting bigger. So just when you thought you might have enough deposit, it's not going to be enough anyway. And these people have to look at older generations living in multi-million-dollar properties who were able to easily buy them working an average full-time job. It's enough to make someone a little bit pissed. Now, it's not doom and gloom for property owners. In fact, it's the opposite. People who bought property before the year 2000 were able to buy cheaply and just ride the wave as properties became more and more expensive from then on. And because property prices have risen so drastically in Australia, it allows those property owners to be able to purchase more property due to their increased equity levels. And that's seen by the stats that 1 in 3 households now own at least one investment property. So property owners are buying more property while those out of the market are struggling to buy even one. And just like Miss Hickman says, and they'll always say that they worked hard and they sacrificed, and yes, some of them might have, but there's renters right now who are working hard, sacrificing, but still can't afford their own home. So where did it all go wrong for Australia? Well, according to finance columnist Alan Kohler, the crisis is a result of 50 years of government policy failure, financialization and greed. And it all started to go bad when the federal government introduced tax changes which incentivized the buying and selling of homes for profit. And this same phenomenon shows up in the property price to disposable income ratio. And as you can see, the gap between property prices and disposable income, or the income you receive after all taxes are taken out, keeps widening. So on top of the housing policies which encourage property speculation, like negative gearing and capital gains tax discount, we've had a sharp spike in immigration where the average immigration levels keep rising, combined with various government grants which help push up house prices. And in the mix, we've got foreign ownership of property, where wealthy foreigners are easily able to outbid locals to buy property as an investment, and also ultra cheap debt, where for years before COVID, interest rates kept getting pushed lower and lower, encouraging more and more people to get into debt to buy property. So all these factors have sent Australian house prices through the roof, but Mr. Kohler said it's the tax breaks that have forever changed the way that Australians think about housing. And that's because you can loan the most for property, way more than any other asset class, but at the same time negatively gear any losses on your investment, and then when it's time to sell, only pay 50% of capital gains tax. So you borrow millions, can claim huge amounts of deductions including depreciation, so property investors get all these benefits, and on top of these tax breaks for investors, for the home that you own, you actually pay zero capital gains tax if you ever sell it. So this is another massive tax break for a homeowner that non-homers do not get. So if you bought a house years ago for $200,000 and in 30 years that house is now worth $1.5 million, then you could sell that home and pay zero capital gains tax on it, and then downsize and invest the difference into something else. And people say, yeah, but you haven't really got an advantage because you got to buy into the same housing market. But yes, you have a massive advantage compared to non-homeowners, because you've had an asset that's massively grown in wealth that you pay no tax on, while a non-homeowner has to pay tax on any bit of savings or investments that they make. And because they haven't had the advantage of loaning huge amounts into property, any of their gains are likely to be much, much lower. So could Australia actually start improving housing affordability for future generations? They could, but there'd have to be a purging of the idea that housing is a means to create wealth as opposed to simply a place to live. But it would take courage and innovation from policymakers, according to Mr. Kohler, as it will upset a large class of voters. And critics say that successive governments have been unwilling to upset this voter group, as well as go against the huge, powerful vested interests who want to see property prices remain ultra high year after year. But if you've got a problem, for example, the speculative nature of the Australian housing market, shouldn't we be striving to fix it no matter what? Because if we don't, we're betraying future generations by handing them a housing market that is broken and unfair. So why might 2023 be the year that the Australian dream of home ownership officially died? Because the speculative demand for Australian property may now have reached a point of no return. You see, Australian house prices were already expensive before COVID, but during COVID, government and central bank policies sent house prices through the roof. So we were here at expensive, but then we went to extremely ridiculously expensive. Rental vacancy levels plummeted, which saw crazy demand for rentals and saw rent prices surging. Cost of living expenses have skyrocketed over the last few years, and then we saw interest rates surge, with the cash rate going from 0.1% to 4.35%. Now, the most worrying thing about 2023 is that as interest rates got higher and higher, demand for property started increasing and house prices started rising again after an initial dip. And by the end of 2023, the average house price in Australia has reached record all-time highs. So even after 13 interest rate rises, which has put huge pressure on people with large mortgages and completely hammered borrowing capacity, we've still got ridiculous speculative demand for property. And we know why there's so much speculative demand for property in Australia is because everyone wants some of those tax-effective, oversized gains that have resulted from property investment over the last 3 decades. And also, renting in Australia is so ridiculously bad and just one step away from homelessness that people are absolutely desperate to get into the property market, even if it's just to have a secure place to live. So the Australian dream of home ownership really has been demolished for millions of Australians, and that's eroding the entire entire foundation of Australia's national identity. Australia used to be the land of the fair go, where everybody had great opportunities to work hard and be successful. But now education and hard work are no longer the main determinants of how wealthy you are, but rather it comes down to where you live and what sort of house you inherit from your parents. And that makes Australia less of an egalitarian meritocracy and more of a landowning class system. Or as Miss Hickman sums up, and paraphrasing, the Australian housing market is a speculative commodity that is extraordinarily rigged in favour of those who already own property. I'm Biko Konstantinos.